The autumn wind rustled through the tree-lined street of Brooklyn Heights as he stood there, frozen in place. 3 years had passed since he'd last seen this brownstone, that home. His home. The steps leading up to the front door seemed longer now, more daunting than ever before. The familiar red brick walls held memories that made his heart ache with every beat. He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd never managed to shake even after years away from Wall Street. The designer suit he wore felt like armor, but it couldn't protect him from what waited behind that door. Through the bay window, he caught glimpses of movement inside. And then he saw her. She moved through the living room, her hand resting gently on her pregnant belly, unaware of his presence outside. The sight knocked the air from his lungs. She looked different, yet exactly the same. Her dark hair was shorter now, falling just past her shoulders, and she carried herself with a quiet strength he didn't remember from before. The wedding ring he'd given her was noticeably absent from her finger. His throat tightened as memories flooded back. Their first date at that tiny Italian restaurant in the village, where they'd talked until the owner had to practically kick them out. The night he proposed on the Brooklyn Bridge as snow fell around them. Their wedding day, when she looked at him like he'd held all the answers to happiness in his hands. He pulled out his phone, checking one last time that the files were still there, the evidence that would explain everything. 3 years of investigation, of working from the shadows, of protecting her the only way he knew how. The screen displayed the secure folder containing hundreds of documents, recordings, and paper trails that would finally clear his name. But would it be enough? The weight of the scandal still hung heavy in the air. He could almost see the headlines that had plastered every financial news outlet. Rising star hedge fund manager disappears amid trading scandal. His clients had lost millions, his reputation had been shattered, and worst of all, he'd left her with nothing but a hastily written note that explained nothing at all. A young couple walked past, pushing a stroller, their laughter carrying on the breeze. They reminded him of the future he and his wife had planned, the family they'd talked about starting, the life they'd dreamed of building together. Now she was pregnant, and he hadn't been there when she found out. Hadn't been there for any of it. The magnitude of what he'd missed crashed over him like a wave. Doctor's appointments, ultrasounds, the first flutter of movement, moments he could never get back. He protected her from the investigation, kept her name clear of the mess that had threatened to destroy them both, but at what cost? In his pocket, his fingers brushed against the small silver key he'd never been able to throw away. Would it still work? Did he even have the right to find out? The thought of her changing the locks felt like another punishment he probably deserved. A delivery truck rumbled past, breaking his reverie. He checked his watch. A habit from his trading days when every second could mean millions gained or lost. But time moved differently now. The past 3 years had crawled by in a blur of hotel rooms, encrypted messages, and clandestine meetings with federal investigators, all leading to this moment. The sun was setting now, painting the Brooklyn sky in shades of pink and gold. Through the window, he watched as she settled onto the couch, one hand still cradling her belly while the other reached for a medical journal. Even from here, he could see the familiar crease between her eyebrows as she concentrated. The same expression she'd worn during late nights at the hospital when she was working through a difficult case. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and finally moved toward the steps. The sound of his expensive shoes against the concrete seemed to echo through the quiet street. 3 years of running, of gathering evidence, of protecting her from a scandal that would have destroyed her medical career along with his financial one, it all came down to this moment. His hand shook slightly as he raised it to knock. The familiar brass knocker felt cool against his knuckles. The sound reverberated through the house like a thunderclap in his ears. He heard movement inside, footsteps approaching. This was it. No more running. No more hiding. He had the truth now, proof of his innocence and the real criminals behind the trading scandal. But would truth be enough? Could it make up for 3 years of silence, of letting her believe he'd abandoned her when their love was the one thing he'd been trying to preserve? The door handle turned. His heart stopped. In the fading light of day, standing on the steps of their former home, he prepared himself to face the consequences of the choice he'd made 3 years ago. A choice that had saved her reputation but broken both their hearts. The door opened. 3 years earlier, life had been a different story entirely. The Wall Street office had sparkled with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view that stretched across Manhattan like a concrete dream. He remembered standing there every morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky, while trading numbers scrolled across multiple screens, each digit representing millions in motion. Back then, his corner office had been his second home. The sleek desk, the ergonomic chair, the Bloomberg terminal constantly humming with market updates, it all seemed like a movie set now. Photos of his wife had decorated his desk. Their honeymoon in Bali, a candid shot of her laughing at a charity gala, both of them covered in paint when they first moved into their brownstone. Those photos were probably in a box somewhere now, gathering dust along with the rest of his old life. His wife's career as a children's doctor had always amazed him. While he moved digital fortunes around the globe, she spent her days saving lives and bringing smiles to kids who needed them most. There were different kinds of success stories, but they'd made it work. She understood his late nights during trading seasons, and he'd always made time to attend her hospital fundraisers. They'd been good together, really good. The fall happened faster than anyone could have predicted. One morning, he was managing billions in assets, trusted by some of the city's wealthiest families. By afternoon, everything had started unraveling. The investment strategy he championed, the one that had earned his clients remarkable returns for years, suddenly went sideways. Markets shifted unexpectedly, positions collapsed, and money vanished like smoke in the wind. He remembered the panic in his junior analyst's eyes as they rushed into his office with the news. Millions disappearing by the minute. Client accounts hemorrhaging money. Emergency calls from investors demanding explanations he couldn't give. The weight of responsibility had pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. But it wasn't just about the money. As he dug deeper into the catastrophe, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong, he'd discovered something far more sinister. Hidden transactions, manipulated numbers, trails leading to offshore accounts he'd never authorized. The truth had hit him like a punch to the gut. Someone had set him up to take the fall. That night, he'd stayed at the office until dawn, poring over transaction records and account statements. The more he looked, the worse it got. The scheme went deep, involving senior partners he'd trusted for years. They'd used his successful trading strategy as cover for their own illegal operations, knowing his reputation would make their fraud seem legitimate. He remembered calling his wife that night, telling her he'd be working late again. Her voice had been warm, understanding. "Don't forget to eat something," she'd said, "and try to get some sleep." Those were the last words he'd hear from her for 3 years. If he'd known, he would have said something more meaningful than just "I will." The decision to leave hadn't come easily. He'd spent hours in his office, watching the city lights flicker on as evening fell, weighing his options. If he stayed and fought, the investigation would have dragged everyone down with him. His wife's reputation at the hospital, her career helping children, it would all be tainted by association. The media wouldn't care that she knew nothing about the fraud. They'd dig into everything, turn their lives inside out looking for headlines. So he'd written the note. Even now, he could remember every word, though he'd rewritten it dozens of times that night, each version feeling more inadequate than the last. The final version had been simple. "I'm sorry. What's happening isn't what it seems. Please forgive me someday." He'd left it on their kitchen counter next to her favorite coffee mug. The scandal exploded the next day. His face was everywhere. Newspapers, financial news channels, social media. Wall Street Wonder Boy vanishes amid trading disaster. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of millions in client losses, countless retirement accounts decimated, charitable foundations forced to close their doors. But he hadn't really vanished. He'd gone underground, working with a small team of trusted investigators, gathering evidence piece by piece. Every day, he checked the news from New York, watching his wife handle the media circus with grace and dignity. She never spoke against him, never joined the chorus of angry voices demanding justice. She simply said, "No comment," and continued her work at the hospital. The hardest part hadn't been living in hiding or working endless hours to uncover the truth. It had been knowing that with each passing day, the distance between them grew larger. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, each one a reminder of what he'd sacrificed. He'd watched from afar as she'd sold their summer house, donated his clothes to charity, and slowly rebuilt her life without him. Now, 3 years later, standing at her door with a file full of evidence that could change everything, he wondered if any explanation could bridge the gap those years had created. The truth about the fraud might clear his name in the financial world, but in the space between two hearts, different rules applied. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Brooklyn street as the weight of the past 3 years settled around him. Sometimes the right choice and the hardest choice were the same thing. He just hoped she would understand that once she knew the whole story. The children's ward had become her sanctuary in the months after he left. While her personal life crumbled, she found solace in the bright murals of cartoon animals and the innocent laughter of her young patients. 12-hour shifts merged into 18-hour marathons as she threw herself into her work, finding purpose in healing others while her own heart remained broken. That morning, like so many others, started in her office reviewing patient files. The autumn sun streamed through the window, catching the empty spot on her left hand where her wedding ring used to rest. She'd taken it off 6 months after he disappeared, though it had taken another 6 months to stop feeling its phantom weight. "Doctor?" A nurse poked her head in. "Your first patient is ready." The day unfolded like any other, checking vitals, reviewing treatment plans, consoling worried parents. She'd always been good at compartmentalizing, at pushing her personal pain aside to focus on the children who needed her. But lately, something felt different. The constant nausea wasn't just from skipping breakfast anymore. The pregnancy test had sat in her bathroom drawer for 3 days before she found the courage to use it. 2 pink lines appeared almost immediately, mocking the carefully ordered life she'd rebuilt. The timing told her everything she needed to know, their last night together, when neither of them knew it would be the last. She kept the news to herself at first, processing it during quiet moments between patient rounds. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years helping other women bring new life into the world, and now she faced her own pregnancy alone. The media vultures still circled, hoping for any morsel of scandal related to her husband's disappearance. This would be exactly the kind of headline they'd love. Her colleagues noticed the changes before she announced anything. The subtle adjustments to her scrubs, the extra breaks she needed, the way she avoided the coffee that had once been her lifeline during long shifts. When she finally told her department head, his concern was immediate and genuine. "Take it easy," he'd said, adjusting her schedule to reduce her hours. "You've carried this department for 3 years. Let us carry you for a while." The support from her hospital family meant everything. They'd formed a protective circle around her, shielding her from prying reporters and keeping her schedule manageable. Young nurses brought her ginger tea for the morning sickness, and fellow doctors covered her on-call shifts without being asked. At home, in the quiet of their, known her, brownstone, she began preparing for single motherhood. The spare room that had once been his home office slowly transformed into a nursery. She painted the walls herself, a soft green that reminded her of spring mornings. Each brush stroke felt like therapy, covering the past with hope for the future. The first ultrasound had been the hardest. Lying there alone, watching the grainy image of her baby on the screen, she couldn't help but imagine him beside her, holding her hand, his eyes wide with wonder. Instead, she gripped the edge of the examination table and smiled through tears as the technician pointed out tiny hands and feet. Her patients became an unexpected source of strength. Children had a way of cutting through adult complications with simple truths. A young girl, recovering from surgery, had patted her growing belly and declared, "Your baby is lucky. You fix everyone who's hurting." The comment had stayed with her, a reminder that healing wasn't just about medicine. Some nights, she still found herself reaching for her phone, muscle memory trying to send him a message about her day. The folder of prenatal vitamins on her nightstand seemed to mock these moments of weakness. She'd learned to redirect these impulses into writing. Letters to their unborn child, documenting everything she wished she could share with its father. The pregnancy progressed, and with it came a strange peace. Each kick and movement reminded her that even from the deepest betrayals, something beautiful could grow. She started taking prenatal yoga classes, joined a support group for single mothers, and slowly let herself imagine a future different from the one she'd planned but precious in its own way. Her co-workers threw her a baby shower in the hospital cafeteria, decorating it with balloons and streamers. The gifts were practical: diapers, onesies, books, but it was the cards that moved her to tears. Each one contained not just well wishes but promises of help, offers of babysitting, and reminders that she wasn't alone. As her due date approached, she found herself standing in the nursery more often, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other touching the soft blankets in the crib. The room held no trace of him now, and yet, sometimes, in the quiet moments between night shifts and morning rounds, she caught herself wondering, where was he? Did he know about the baby? Would he care if he did? The questions had no answers, and she'd learned to let them float away unanswered. She had a new life to focus on now, literally. The baby's strong kicks seemed to punctuate this thought, as if agreeing that the future mattered more than the past. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength that had carried her through the last 3 years. Little did she know, as she stood there planning for a future as a single mother, that the past was about to knock on her front door. The living room felt too small for the weight of the moment. She sat on one end of the couch, her hands protectively cradling her belly, while he remained standing, his laptop open on the coffee table between them. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the hardwood floors they'd picked out together years ago. "I need you to see something," he said softly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The familiar sound of his voice after 3 years of silence made her heart squeeze painfully in her chest. He looked older, tired lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but his hands still moved with that careful precision she remembered so well. The screen came to life with documents, spreadsheets, and email chains. To most people, they would have looked like meaningless financial data, but she'd been married to a Wall Street trader long enough to recognize transaction records and account statements. He began explaining, his voice steady but strained. "The trading strategy wasn't the problem," he said, pulling up a series of graphs. "Someone was using it as cover for something much bigger. Look at these transactions." He pointed to a series of numbers that seemed to appear and disappear across different accounts. "They were hiding money movements behind my legitimate trades, millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts I never knew existed." She leaned forward despite herself, drawn in by the urgency in his voice. The baby kicked, as if sensing her attention. The documents on screen told a story of carefully orchestrated fraud, senior partners at the firm using his successful trading record as camouflage for their own illegal operations. "When I discovered this," he continued, pulling up more files, "I knew they'd already set everything up to make me take the fall. All the unauthorized transactions were linked to my trading codes. They'd been planning it for months, maybe years." Her medical training had taught her to look for patterns, to piece together symptoms into a complete diagnosis. Now she found herself doing the same with his evidence. The timing of transactions, the way money moved through accounts, the carefully crafted paper trail, it all pointed to a deliberate setup. "But why did you leave?" The question that had haunted her for 3 years finally escaped her lips. "Why didn't you fight it?" He pulled out a USB drive and plugged it into the laptop. A new window opened, showing newspaper articles from 3 years ago. Headlines about other financial scandals, stories of families destroyed, careers ruined. But these weren't about him, they were about other cases, other families. They didn't just go after their targets, he explained, his voice dropping lower. They went after spouses, children, anyone they could use for leverage. One doctor lost his medical license because of anonymous complaints about his judgment. Another trader's wife lost her teaching position over fabricated misconduct charges. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her work at the Children's Hospital, her reputation in the medical community, everything she'd worked for would have been at risk. She remembered the media frenzy that had followed his disappearance, reporters digging for any angle they could find. "I couldn't let them do that to you," he said, finally sinking into a chair. "Your patients needed you. Those kids and their families, they couldn't lose you because of me. So I left, gathered evidence from overseas, worked with federal investigators who knew something wasn't right about the whole situation." The laptop screen now showed surveillance photos, recorded phone calls, bank records. 3 years of careful investigation laid bare on her coffee table. Evidence that would clear his name, but also reveal something deeper. Every choice, every move he'd made had been to protect her. "The federal agents are moving in today," he said, checking his phone. "Right now, actually. The whole network is being shut down. Senior partners, corrupt administrators, everyone involved. It's over. As if on cue, breaking news alerts started popping up on both their phones. Headlines about arrests at major financial firms, mentions of a years-long investigation, hints at a whistleblower who had worked with authorities. His story finally coming to light, but not yet connected to him publicly. She stood up slowly, one hand still on her belly, and walked to the window. Outside, life continued as normal, neighbors walking dogs, delivery trucks making their rounds, children playing in the afternoon sun. How strange that the world could look so ordinary on a day when everything was changing. You could have told me, she said finally, turning back to face him. We could have faced it together. He shook his head, and for the first time, she saw tears in his eyes. They were watching everything. One wrong move, one hint that you knew anything, and they would have destroyed your career. I couldn't risk it. You were too important. Your work, your patience, everything you've built. The baby kicked again, stronger this time. His eyes dropped to her belly, and the pain in them was almost unbearable to watch. 3 years of separation, of protecting her from afar, only to return and find out what he'd missed. How? He started, then stopped, his voice rough. How far along are you? 7 months, she answered softly. I found out after you left. It was our last night together. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of time lost, moments missed, choices made with love but carried out in pain. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, perhaps heading toward the financial district where his evidence was finally bringing down the real criminals. She watched him absorb the news, saw the emotions play across his face, joy, grief, regret, hope, all mixing together in a storm of feelings that matched her own. The truth had finally come out, but truth, she was learning, was just the beginning of healing. Night had fallen outside the brownstones' windows as they sat in what used to be their shared living room. The space between them on the couch felt like miles, filled with 3 years of unspoken words and missed moments. Her tea had gone cold, untouched on the coffee table beside his evidence files. I need to understand something, she said, breaking the heavy silence. You spent 3 years gathering evidence, working with federal agents, living in hiding. She paused, collecting her thoughts. But not once did you try to contact me. Not even a sign that you were okay. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at his clasped hands. Every day, I wanted to reach out. Every single day. His voice was rough with emotion. But they were watching you. The firm had people monitoring your phone, your email, everything. One wrong move and what? She interrupted, years of buried anger finally surfacing. They'd ruined my career. Was my career worth more than our marriage? Than our life together? Her hand moved instinctively to her belly as the baby stirred, responding to her raised voice. The movement caught his eye, and pain flashed across his face. You don't understand. These people, they didn't just threaten careers. There were accidents, mysterious complications in simple surgeries, sudden investigations into normal medical procedures. They destroyed lives completely. She stood up, needing to move, to process. The familiar walls of her home felt different somehow, as if they too were absorbing these revelations. I'm a doctor, she said finally. I deal with life and death every day. I could have handled it. We could have handled it together. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back. Do you know what it was like? Reading that note over and over, trying to make sense of it. Watching the news tear apart everything we built, everything you were. Having to face our friends, our families, not knowing whether to defend you or hate you. He stood too, taking a step toward her before stopping himself. I know. I watched from afar. Every news story, every press conference where you said, no comment, and held your head high. I saw it all. And it killed me, but I knew you were strong enough to survive it. Strong enough to rebuild. But I didn't want to rebuild alone. The words burst out of her. I wanted my husband. I needed you here when I found out about the baby. During the morning sickness, the first ultrasound, all of it. Instead, I got silence. Do you know how many times I picked up the phone to call you, just out of habit, before remembering you were gone? He moved to the window, looking out at the Brooklyn street where their life together had once seemed so certain. I recorded messages for you, he admitted quietly. Hundreds of them. Explaining everything, apologizing, telling you about the progress of the investigation. I never sent them, never could, but I needed to talk to you somehow. She watched his reflection in the window glass, seeing the toll the years had taken. The confident Wall Street trader was gone, replaced by someone who looked both stronger and more vulnerable. "Show me," she said suddenly. He turned. "What?" "The messages. You said you recorded them. Show me." Slowly, he pulled out his phone, fingers moving across the screen. A hidden folder appeared, filled with video files, each dated and labeled. He handed her the phone, and she sank back onto the couch, pressing play on the first one. His voice from 3 years ago filled the room. "My love, I left this morning. I know by now you found the note. I know it's not enough, not nearly enough." She watched as a younger version of him, raw with pain and fear, tried to explain the unexplainable. More videos followed. Him in different hotel rooms, different countries, always speaking to her as if she were there. Updates on the investigation mixed with personal moments, memories of their life together, hopes for her future, even simple things like wishing her happy birthday or happy anniversary. "I didn't know if I'd ever be able to show these to you," he said softly, watching her watch his past self. "But I couldn't bear the thought of not telling you everything, even if the words never reached you." The latest video was from just days ago. In it, he stood outside their brownstone, gathering courage to knock. "I don't know if you'll forgive me," his recorded voice said. "I don't know if you should. But the truth is finally ready to come out, and you deserve to hear it first." She lowered the phone, her other hand still resting on her belly. The baby was active now, as if aware of the emotional storm in the room. 3 years of messages," she said quietly. 3 years of watching from a distance, protecting me from shadows I never saw coming. He knelt in front of her, careful to maintain some distance but close enough that she could see the tears in his eyes. "I made a choice," he said. "Maybe it was wrong. Maybe we could have found another way. But I couldn't gamble with your life, your career, everything you'd worked for. I loved you too much to risk it." "Love," she repeated, tasting the word. "Love is supposed to be a partnership. We promised that to each other, remember, for better or worse." "I remember every word of our vows," he whispered, "every promise I made, including the one to protect you, no matter what." The night grew deeper outside their windows as they sat there, 3 years of separation slowly melting into understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something like it. The truth had finally been spoken, but the harder truth was yet to come. What would they do with it now? The hospital waiting room buzzed with quiet energy as early morning light filtered through the windows. He sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his tie loosened, watching the door to the delivery ward. Their baby had decided to arrive 2 weeks early, turning a quiet Sunday evening into a rush to the hospital. His testimony in the financial fraud case had concluded just days before. The media storm had slowly settled, replaced by a different kind of anticipation. Now, after hours of waiting, he was about to become a father. The nurse appeared at the door, smiling. "She's asking for you." Inside the delivery room, his wife lay propped up against pillows, her face tired but glowing. And there, bundled in her arms, was their daughter. Tiny fingers, a button nose, and a head full of dark hair, she was perfect. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly, and his heart nearly burst at the sight of them together. He approached carefully, as if in a dream. The baby yawned, and he felt tears spring to his eyes. After everything, the scandal, the separation, the slow process of rebuilding trust, this moment felt like a miracle. "Do you want to hold her?" his wife asked, and he nodded, not trusting his voice. The weight of his daughter in his arms changed something deep inside him. All those years of gathering evidence, of working from the shadows to protect his wife's career, it had cost him so much. But looking at this tiny face, he knew he'd do it all again if it meant keeping them safe. "She has your eyes," his wife said, watching them together. The past few months had been a careful dance of rebuilding. Weekly counseling sessions, honest conversations that stretched late into the night, learning to trust again one small step at a time. The media had eventually gotten the full story: the whistleblower who sacrificed everything to expose corruption, the doctor wife who rebuilt her life while carrying their child, the slow journey back to each other. But they'd weathered that storm together this time. His old firm was gone now, its reputation destroyed by the scandal. Some of his former colleagues faced years in prison. Others had turned state's evidence, confirming every detail of his testimony. His own name had been cleared, his reputation restored. But none of that mattered as much as this moment. "I never thought I'd be here," he admitted quietly, gently rocking their daughter. "There were days in hiding when I was sure I'd lost everything forever." His wife reached out, taking his hand. The simple gesture meant more than any words could express. They'd come so far from that day, he'd reappeared on her doorstep with a file full of evidence and a heart full of regret. "The nursery's ready," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. They'd finished it together just last week, painting over the green walls she'd done alone with a softer shade they'd chosen as a couple. His old office had become a space of new beginnings. The baby made a tiny sound, and they both laughed softly. Outside the window, the city was waking up, unaware that their whole world had just shifted on its axis. "The hospital board called yesterday," she said, adjusting her pillow. "They want to expand the children's ward. New facilities, more beds, better equipment." She paused, looking at him meaningfully. "They're looking for donors." He understood immediately. The money he'd recovered, his share of the whistleblower settlement, it could do real good here. Not just numbers on a trading screen, but actual lives changed. "I think that's perfect," he said, carefully passing their daughter back to her mother. A fresh start, something good coming from all of this. Through the window, they could see the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance, where he proposed years ago. The city skyline beyond it had changed, just as they had changed. But some things remained constant: love, hope, the chance for redemption. "We still have a lot to figure out," she said, voicing the reality they both knew. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. But they'd learned that honesty, even when it hurt, was better than protective lies. "One day at a time," he replied, echoing her words from months ago. Together. Their daughter slept peacefully, unaware that her very existence was a bridge between past and future, hurt and healing. The morning sun painted the room in soft gold, a new day dawning for their rebuilt family. A nurse came in to check vitals, smiling at the picture they made. "Have you decided on a name?" They looked at each other, sharing a moment of perfect understanding. The name they'd chosen together meant new beginning, a fresh start after the storm. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Somewhere in the financial district, others now sat at trading desks, moving digital fortunes. But here in this quiet room, a different kind of wealth was being counted, in tiny fingers and toes, in second chances, in love that had weathered the hardest tests and emerged stronger. Their daughter yawned again, and they both smiled. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family. The truth had set them free, but love had brought them home.